The next morning, as soon as Elizabeth left for work, Wilson gathered all his strength and began shouting. His voice echoed through the mansion, bouncing off the thick walls. "Help! Somebody, help me!" At first, silence answered him. But he refused to stop. Hour after hour, he screamed until his throat ached. Finally, just as the sun began to dip, he thought he heard something faint, footsteps outside. "Who's there?" Wilson cried desperately. "Please, I'm trapped." On the other side of the wall, Dammy froze, his ears straining. The muffled voice was coming from inside the mansion. His heart pounded. He had worked for Elizabeth for years, but never once imagined something sinister was hidden in her grand home. For the first time, Dammy began to suspect that Madame Lizzie's wealth carried a shadow. And now, he knew he had to choose: stay silent, or risk everything to seek help. Dammy stood frozen by the side of the mansion wall, his ears sharp and his heart racing. He had clearly heard a man's voice calling for help, but inside Elizabeth's home? That seemed impossible. Madame Lizzie was wealthy, generous, and respected in society. What business would she have locking up a man inside her house? But the cries came again, hoarse, desperate, unmistakable. "Please, somebody help me." Dammy's chest tightened. He glanced nervously at the gate, afraid Elizabeth might return and catch him lingering where he had no business. Yet he couldn't shake the sound of suffering he had just heard. He had been Elizabeth's gateman for 3 years. She was a strict woman, yes, but he had never suspected she could be cruel. That night, Dammy hardly slept in his tiny quarters near the gate. He kept hearing Wilson's voice in his head, as if the man was haunting him. By morning, he knew he couldn't ignore it any longer. He waited until Elizabeth drove out for work in her white Bentley, her horn echoing like always. Once the gates shut behind her, Dammy quickly slipped outside, glancing around to make sure none of the guards saw him. He walked fast, his heart pounding, until he reached the small police outpost 2 streets away. When he entered, the officers looked up in surprise. Dammy hesitated before speaking, his voice low. "Officers, I think something is happening in Madame Elizabeth's mansion. I heard someone crying for help inside." A man's voice. The policemen exchanged glances. "Are you sure?" one of them asked. "Madame Elizabeth? The billionaire? She helps this whole community. Are you saying she's keeping someone prisoner?" Dammy swallowed hard. "I know it sounds crazy, but I heard it with my own ears. Please, at least check." The officers whispered among themselves. Finally, one leaned forward. "All right, we'll watch the house. But if you're lying, you'll be in trouble." Dammy nodded quickly. He wasn't lying. Deep down, he knew he had just lit a fuse that would explode into something bigger than he imagined. The next day, Elizabeth's mansion became the focus of quiet eyes. 3 plain-clothed policemen stationed themselves at different corners of the street. From the outside, they appeared like ordinary passers-by. One pretending to be a newspaper vendor, another loitering near a shop, and the third sitting on a parked motorcycle. But their eyes were fixed on the tall iron gates that guarded Elizabeth's empire. Inside, Wilson's suffering continued. His throat was raw from screaming the day before, but he refused to give up. Every time he heard the faintest sound outside, he shouted with all his strength, "Help! Somebody, please!" His voice cracked, but desperation fueled him. The policeman reported back to Dammy later in the evening. "We've been watching. The house is locked tight. No one comes in or out except Madame herself. But we can't move in without proof. We need to be sure there's someone inside." Dammy clenched his fists. "I'm telling you, there's a man in there." His voice. "Calm down, one officer interrupted. "We'll catch her. But patience is needed. If she suspects we're onto her, she might move him, or worse." That night, Elizabeth returned in her red sports car, honking impatiently. Dammy opened the gate with shaking hands, forcing a smile as she drove past. The policeman watched from the shadows, noting the time. Elizabeth strutted inside, unaware of the silent eyes tracking her every move. Upstairs, Wilson heard the familiar click of the door opening. His heart sank. Another night of torment. But this time, as Elizabeth approached him with her usual wicked smile, Wilson held onto a flicker of hope. He knew someone had heard him. He prayed the outside world was finally beginning to close in on Elizabeth's fortress of secrets. The hunters were watching now. It was only a matter of time before the cage cracked. Elizabeth hummed softly as she entered her bedroom that night, her heels tapping against the marble floor. Wilson lay on the bed, his body weak, his eyes hollow. He had stopped begging each time she appeared, not because he had given up, but because he was saving his strength. Deep inside, he still believed help was coming. Elizabeth set her handbag down and sat beside him, brushing her fingers along his face. "You're looking thin," she said almost sweetly. "But don't worry, I'll make sure you survive. You belong to me now, Wilson. The outside world doesn't deserve you." Wilson turned his head away, silent. Elizabeth's smile faded. "You will talk to me when I speak to you," she snapped. She untied one of his hands just enough for him to eat from the tray she had brought, fried rice and grilled fish. He refused at first, but she forced the spoon into his mouth. "You must eat. I don't want you dying on me." When she was satisfied, she tied him back again, kissing his forehead like a mother soothing a child. To her, it was affection. To Wilson, it was torture. Outside, the police kept watch. For 3 nights, they had studied her movements. The times she left, the times she returned, the way Dammy opened the gate for her. They grew convinced something was inside that mansion, something Elizabeth was hiding. One officer whispered to another, "If we storm the house without evidence, we risk everything. But if we wait too long, that poor man might not survive." By the 4th night, their patience was wearing thin. Wilson's muffled cries, faint but distinct, reached one of the officers standing close to the fence. He stiffened. "Did you hear that?" he whispered to his partner. "Yes. It's him." The proof they had been waiting for had finally arrived. Elizabeth, oblivious, was tightening her grip on Wilson, believing she had built an unbreakable cage. But outside her golden walls, justice was quietly drawing its sword. The officers returned to their station that night with a renewed sense of urgency. They had finally heard it, Wilson's faint, muffled cry coming from inside Elizabeth's mansion. It was all the confirmation they needed. Detective Chinadu, the man leading the case, stood before his team with a stern face. "We move tomorrow. But we must be smart. Elizabeth is powerful, wealthy, and clever. If she senses even the smallest mistake, she'll cover her tracks and make Wilson disappear forever." The plan was laid out carefully. Half the team would remain hidden outside the mansion, observing every movement, while the other half prepared the legal documents needed for a full search warrant. The key was patience, striking at the right time. Meanwhile, inside the mansion, Elizabeth had no idea the walls were closing in on her. She spent the evening showing Wilson pictures of the two of them together on her phone. Most of the pictures had been taken without his consent, while he was unconscious, bound, or half asleep. She scrolled through them with delight. "Look at us, Wilson," she said with a wide smile. "We're perfect together. The world just doesn't understand our love." Wilson's voice cracked with exhaustion. Elizabeth, this isn't love. You're destroying me. She slapped him sharply across the face, her smile fading into rage. You don't get to tell me what love is. You'll learn, even if it takes years. She stormed out, leaving Wilson alone in the dimly lit room. His heart pounded. He had been holding on to hope for days, but fear now clawed at him. Could the police even find him in time? Outside, the surveillance team kept their eyes on the mansion. Every movement was noted, the times Elizabeth's driver arrived, the food supplies that were brought in, the lights that flickered on and off in different rooms. At midnight, Detective Chinadu sent a message to his team. Be ready. We strike at dawn. Wilson, trapped in silence, had no idea that rescue was creeping closer, step by step, through the darkness. The night dragged on slowly. Wilson barely slept. Every sound in the house made his heart jolt. He feared Elizabeth would suddenly appear at his door again. His body was weak, but his mind was clinging to one fragile thread of hope. That somehow, someone outside would hear his cries. At exactly 5 a.m., the stillness of the early morning broke. Several unmarked police vans rolled quietly to a stop a few blocks away from Elizabeth's mansion. Officers in plain clothes gathered under the command of Detective Chinadu. Their voices were low, sharp, and precise. We move in 30 minutes, Chinadu whispered. No mistakes. She has cameras everywhere, and she pays for silence. But today, she will face the law. Back at the mansion, Elizabeth was already awake. She loved mornings. Dressed in a silk designer robe, she sipped her coffee while flipping through reports from her businesses. Her life seemed untouchable. Wealth, power, beauty, everything was under her control. Or so she thought. Wilson, chained and broken, tried once more to loosen the ropes around his wrists. His skin was raw from the constant struggle, but the hope of freedom pushed him harder. He prayed silently. God, let them find me today. Please. At 5:30 a.m., the officers moved closer. They spread out silently, surrounding the mansion like shadows. The gatehouse was the first target. Dammy, the gateman, was startled when he saw men approaching from all directions. But when Chinadu raised his badge and whispered, "We're here for Wilson," Dammy's fear melted into relief. Without hesitation, he nodded and unlocked the gate. Within minutes, the compound was crawling with officers. They moved swiftly, disabling cameras, covering blind spots, and positioning themselves at every entrance. Detective Chinadu gave the final signal. We breach in 5, 4, 3. The silence of dawn was shattered as the mansion's heavy front doors were forced open. Officers stormed inside, their voices echoing. Police, don't move. Wilson's heart skipped. For the first time in weeks, he heard the sound of hope crashing through the walls of his prison. Elizabeth, still in her robe, froze mid-step. The cup of coffee slipped from her hands and shattered on the marble floor. Her empire of power and secrecy was collapsing before her eyes. Elizabeth's eyes darted across the living room as the police stormed in. Her breathing quickened, but she forced a smirk onto her face. Gentlemen, she said coldly, folding her arms. This is my home. Do you know who I am? Do you know how much trouble you've just invited into your lives? Detective Chinadu stepped forward, unshaken. We know exactly who you are, Elizabeth. And we know what you've been hiding. Where is Wilson? Elizabeth's smirk faltered for a second, but she quickly regained composure. Wilson? I don't know any Wilson. This is a violation of my privacy. I'll have my lawyers here in minutes. Take her aside, Chinadu ordered firmly. Two officers grabbed her by the arms. She tried to resist, twisting violently and screaming, "Unhand me! Do you have any idea how much power I wield? You can't do this to me." Meanwhile, other officers began searching the mansion. They moved from room to room, opening doors, checking hidden corridors, and tearing apart her flawless world of marble floors and golden chandeliers. Upstairs, Wilson heard the commotion. His heart thundered in his chest. He tried to shout, his voice cracked from exhaustion, "Help! Up here, please! I'm here!" One of the officers froze. "Did you hear that?" he asked his partner. They followed the faint sound until they reached a large locked door. The officer kicked it hard, once, twice, until the heavy wood splintered and gave way. The scene that met them stopped them cold. Wilson lay on the massive bed, wrists tied raw with rope, his face pale and hollow from weeks of abuse. He stared at the officers with tear-filled eyes that carried both pain and relief. You found me," he whispered hoarsely. The officers rushed to his side, cutting the ropes carefully. "You're safe now. It's over," one reassured him. Downstairs, Elizabeth was still fighting like a trapped lioness. But when Detective Chinadu's voice thundered, "We found him," her entire body went stiff. Her face drained of color. For the first time, the mask of control slipped completely. She screamed, kicking wildly, "No! He's mine! You can't take him from me!" But the officers dragged her away as Wilson was carried gently down the staircase, wrapped in a blanket. His fragile frame told a story that words could never fully express. The empire Elizabeth had built on wealth and power had crumbled in an instant. And in its place, the ugly truth of her secret life stood bare for the world to see. The police vans screeched into the city hospital's emergency wing just after sunrise. Wilson, wrapped in a white blanket, was rushed inside on a stretcher. His body was weak, his lips cracked, and his eyes half closed, but there was a flicker of relief in his expression. For weeks he had lived in darkness and despair, and now, at last, he was surrounded by light, noise, and human kindness. Doctors and nurses crowded around him. "Dehydrated," one said quickly. "Malnourished. Deep rope burns. Psychological trauma." The words flew like arrows, but all Wilson could hear was the soft voice of a nurse who leaned close and whispered, "You are safe now." As the doctors worked, Detective Chinadu watched from the hallway. He had seen many cases, but this one weighed heavily on him. Wilson wasn't just a victim. He was a young man whose entire life had been snatched and twisted by Elizabeth's selfishness. Chinadu clenched his fists. She will not walk free from this. Not this time. Meanwhile, Elizabeth was transported to the police headquarters. She was no longer in her flowing designer robe but in a plain prison garment. Her wrists were handcuffed, her hair was messy, and her eyes burned with rage. Yet even then, she carried herself like a queen, glaring at every officer she passed. The courtroom was packed to its limits. Journalists jostled for space, cameras clicked without rest, and the air was thick with anticipation. This was not just another trial. It was the reckoning of one of the most powerful women the country had ever seen. Elizabeth entered, her wrists cuffed, her face set in a mask of defiance. Even now, she walked with the grace of a queen, her chin high, her eyes cold. Her lawyers followed closely, whispering last-minute strategies. Then Wilson entered. The room fell silent. Though still fragile from his ordeal, he stood tall, his mother by his side. The murmurs began: sympathy, anger, respect. For the first time, Wilson felt the weight of a nation behind him. When it was his turn to speak, the courtroom hung on every word. His voice trembled at first, but soon grew steadier. "She took everything from me," he said, his eyes locked on Elizabeth. My freedom, my dignity, my strength. I begged her to stop. I begged her to let me go. But she treated me like I wasn't human, like I was her property. I don't stand here today because I am strong. I stand here because I survived. And I want justice, not just for myself, but for anyone who has ever been silenced by people like her. The room erupted in murmurs. Elizabeth's jaw tightened, but her mask was slipping. For the first time, there was fear in her eyes. The prosecution presented evidence. The ropes, the bruises, the testimonies of staff who had grown suspicious, even financial trails that suggested Elizabeth had silenced others in the past. Her empire of wealth and charm was being stripped bare, piece by piece. Elizabeth's defense fought hard, claiming Wilson was after her money, that it was a consensual affair gone wrong. But her arrogance betrayed her. At one point, she screamed across the courtroom, "He wanted it. He's lying." The judge's gavel slammed down. Order. The final verdict came after hours of deliberation. The judge's voice was firm, unshaken. Elizabeth Adewale, you are hereby found guilty of unlawful imprisonment, repeated sexual assault, and abuse of power. You are sentenced to 30 years in prison without the possibility of early release. Gasps filled the room. Elizabeth froze. Her face drained of color, her body trembling as the officers placed cuffs on her once more. She tried to speak, but no words came. The Queen had fallen. Wilson, watching quietly, felt tears well in his eyes. Not tears of weakness, but of release. He turned to his mother, who embraced him tightly. "It's over," she whispered. "You are free." And as Elizabeth was led out of the courtroom, her head bowed for the first time in years, Wilson knew this wasn't just the end of her reign. It was the beginning of his healing. The world outside cheered, chanting his name, celebrating justice. Elizabeth had been powerful, untouchable, feared, but in the end, truth had brought her down. And Wilson walked out of that courthouse, no longer a victim, but a survivor who had faced the storm and emerged stronger. No matter how powerful or wealthy you are, evil done in secret will always be exposed. Justice never sleeps. Thank you so much for watching to the end. Share your thoughts about this story in the comment section because I will love to read them. And guess what? I have more amazing stories coming soon. So like, share and subscribe. Hit the notification bell and stay tuned for more amazing stories with lessons like this. See you soon.